You are a child in this house, watching young George move between shadows and light. His father, George Carshaw, has a fondness for drink and often stumbles through life with more sighs than triumphs. His mother, Lucinda, is strong-willed and musically gifted, and though her singing lessons bring in some income, they also carry her further away from her husband. You'll notice how the young boy keeps his distance, how he studies faces with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. He spends much of his childhood in silence, wandering corners of the house, eavesdropping on adult conversations, and reading whatever scraps of print he can find. The family is not destitute, but they live in a fragile balance, surviving more on appearances than on stability. Dublin itself is alive with contrasts. Elegant streets sit beside grimy lanes, and Shaw sees both worlds. Historians still argue whether his early discomfort made him a sharper critic of society later, or whether he simply inherited a habit of questioning everything. In those early years, you sense how the boy's imagination becomes his refuge. He attends school, though without much enthusiasm, preferring to teach himself by turning pages in musty books. He finds stories of knights, history, and plays, letting his mind wander far from the quarrels echoing through his home. It is said that he hated arithmetic but adored words, shaping sentences in his head long before he put them to paper. A quirky tidbit lingers in his family life. His mother took him and his sisters to London for long stretches to pursue her music career, leaving the boy to shuttle between households and relatives. The arrangement gave him a sense of instability, yet it also exposed him to different kinds of people. You can almost see him watching, memorizing gestures and tones of voice, as if every grown-up were a character in an unwritten play. The boy's connection to art comes largely through music. His mother's dedication to singing fills the house with exercises, scales, and visiting teachers. You hear pianos out of tune, voices warming up, and the boy in the corner taking it all in. While he never becomes a musician, this atmosphere teaches him about rhythm, timing, and performance, qualities he will later fold into his writing for the stage. As you walk with him through the streets of Dublin, you notice the city's changing spirit. Nationalist movements whisper through taverns, preachers thunder in churches, and poor children dart between carriages in search of pennies. Shaw does not yet speak out, but he absorbs. He begins to notice injustices, the way poverty and privilege exist side by side. He learns to watch people not with pity but with curiosity, a habit that will shape his sharp humor. You pause with him in Trinity College's surroundings, though he never enrolls as a student. Instead, he chooses his own path, haunting galleries, attending lectures, listening wherever knowledge can be gathered freely. He does not care for the rigid school system, preferring the thrill of ideas to the discipline of classrooms. This self-directed learning, though unconventional, builds in him a fierce independence of thought. Some neighbors remark that he is aloof, even cold, but if you look closer, you see a boy building an armor of observation, teaching himself how to survive disappointment by turning it into wit. He learns early that humor can protect him from hurt, and cleverness can lift him above chaos. You might think he is lonely, but in truth, he is rehearsing, collecting phrases, inventing arguments, sharpening tools he will one day use against the world. A well-known fact from these years is that Shaw left formal schooling behind before he turned 16, vowing never to return. This decision, shocking to some, freed him to seek his own education in the libraries of Dublin. He took a job as a clerk, shuffling papers by day while feeding his imagination at night. Each figure he saw at work, each weary customer, became another sketch in his mind's growing gallery of characters. As you leave this chapter of his childhood, you carry the image of a lanky, red-haired youth, restless and watchful, straddling two worlds, the grey struggle of his household and the vivid life of his imagination. You know that Dublin will always remain a part of him, even when he crosses the sea to London. For now, though, you linger in the quiet of a young mind, restless but not yet unleashed, waiting for the stage to find him. You leave behind the damp lanes of Dublin and step into the crowded, smoky streets of late Victorian London. It is the spring of 1876, and George Bernard Shaw, just 20 years old, has arrived with little more than his ambition and his stubborn belief that he will not waste his life. You trail him as he drags his heavy boots through rain-soaked pavements, coat threadbare, eyes sharp. He has come not for comfort but for possibility, and though he has no steady income, he carries an unshakable faith in his own mind. His first years here are hard. You see him lodged in cheap rented rooms, with wallpaper peeling and drafts seeping through cracks in the window frames. He lives on the bare minimum, eating little more than bread, apples, and the occasional meal provided by a kind friend. His clothes are patched, his shoes worn thin, yet he does not complain. Instead, he slips each morning into the grand public libraries where warmth and books are free. There, day after day, he sits among strangers, bent over newspapers, novels, political tracts, teaching himself by sheer will. He spends 5 long years in this self-imposed apprenticeship, writing novels that nobody wants to publish. Historians still argue whether his persistence was sheer genius or mere stubbornness bordering on folly. What is clear is that failure never discouraged him. He produced 5 novels in those years, each rejected, each sent back with curt refusals, yet each attempt sharpening his style. You can almost hear the scratch of his pen on cheap paper, see the ink stains spreading across his fingers, while hunger gnaws but does not silence him. A well-known fact about Shaw's London life is his devotion to the British Museum reading room. He treated it like a university without fees, absorbing the works of philosophers, economists, and dramatists. You walk with him beneath the high dome of the reading room, the air thick with dust and murmurs, as he copies notes furiously. His chosen teachers are Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, and Henry George. These voices reshape his thinking, convincing him that literature must serve not only beauty but also justice. One quirky detail that makes you smile is his daily walk from his lodgings to the library. He often could not afford proper transportation, so he walked for miles through London's fog. Using the time to rehearse arguments in his head, he would mutter to himself, gesturing with long arms, drawing odd looks from passers-by. To him, the city became both classroom and stage, every crossing a chance to test a line of dialogue, every stranger a possible character. At night he attended free lectures wherever he could find them, listening to scientists, reformers, and politicians. He rarely agreed with everything he heard, but he learned to debate by arguing in his mind against each point. You sense his restless curiosity, how he cannot let a claim stand unchallenged, how he questions even his own convictions. This habit of constant mental sparring will soon define his plays, where every character speaks with the fire of real debate. Yet these were not glamorous years. He often suffered from ill health, shivering in unheated rooms, living in near isolation. Some friends described him as gaunt, pale, with fiery eyes and little money for meals. Still, he refused charity, choosing instead to endure discomfort as the price of freedom. He was convinced that these lean years were building his resilience, and he often laughed about his hunger, turning it into a story rather than a complaint. During this time, London itself shaped him. You follow him through crowded theaters, where he buys the cheapest ticket and sits in the upper galleries, studying both the play and the audience. He notices how a well-timed line can make a crowd gasp or laugh. He takes mental notes on what works, what fails, and why. Though he has not yet written a successful play, he is already a critic in the making, sharpening his wit against the flaws of others. Historians debate whether Shaw's early failures hardened him or inspired him. Some argue that the rejection of his novels pushed him toward drama, where his ideas could shine in conversation rather than narrative. Others believe he always intended to become a playwright, and the novels were simply a rehearsal. Whatever the truth, you sense that these difficult years were not wasted but carefully forged. A turning point comes when he begins to write for socialist papers and journals. His voice grows more confident, his arguments sharper. He joins public debates, his Irish accent cutting through the smoky air of London meeting halls. He realizes that words can move crowds, that writing is not just solitary labor but a weapon for change. And though fame is still far away, you see him planting the seeds of the playwright and thinker he will soon become. By now, the image of the young man is etched clearly. Tall, red-haired, thin as a reed, stubborn as stone, walking each day from poverty toward possibility. He is not yet celebrated, but he is certain of his path. You leave him for now in the reading room, hunched over a book, pen scratching across the page, his mind alive with arguments that will one day fill theaters. He is poor, but his imagination is rich, and you can almost feel the energy building, waiting for its stage. You move now into the quiet lodgings where Shaw sits at a small wooden desk, candlelight flickering, his shoulders hunched over another manuscript. The air smells of ink, dust, and damp wood. It is the early 1880s, and he is still unknown, still a young man with wild hair and a stubborn will. He has just finished another novel, his 5th attempt, and though he knows the world will likely reject it, he refuses to stop. You sense both the loneliness of this work and the strange joy he takes in it. These novels, never commercially successful in his lifetime, are his first real experiments. They include Immaturity, The Irrational Knot, and Love Among the Artists. Each is full of his sharp observations about society, but they are weighed down by long arguments, their characters more like voices than flesh and blood people. You watch him wrestle with the page, trying to balance philosophy with storytelling, not yet realizing that drama, not prose, will give him the form he needs. Historians still argue whether those early works should be dismissed as failures or cherished as rough sketches of a genius learning his craft. By day, he works dull office jobs, copying letters and accounts, earning just enough to pay rent. But by night, he pours himself into writing. His companions are silence, ink, and the constant hum of thoughts. You can feel how each rejection slip, though painful, feeds his determination. Instead of despairing, he writes more. His belief is simple. Talent must eventually be recognized if he just keeps going. A well-known fact from this period is that Shaw wrote criticism as well as fiction, contributing to small newspapers and socialist journals. His book reviews and essays began to draw attention for their sharp wit. He would praise a book one moment and tear it apart the next, always with clever turns of phrase. This work did not bring him much money, but it built his confidence, teaching him to write with clarity and bite. A quirky detail surfaces in his routine. He He would often draft sections of his novels while standing, not sitting, pacing the room as he dictated sentences to himself. Neighbors reported hearing him declaim aloud, arguing with his own characters as though rehearsing a play. If you pressed your ear to the thin wall, you might think a whole troupe of actors was inside, when in fact it was only Shaw, one voice becoming many. These habits show you something important. Even in his so-called failures, he was rehearsing the rhythm of dialogue. His novels may have been unread, but they were training him to think in conversations, to put arguments into the mouths of characters. Later, when his plays would burst to life on stage, this practice would reveal itself as a hidden strength. You walk with him through the reading room again, where he spends long afternoons studying economics, politics, and philosophy. He becomes fascinated by Henry George's book *Progress and Poverty*, which argues for land reform and economic justice. These ideas grip him deeply, convincing him that writing must also serve society. You sense how this conviction grows. Words are not only for art, but also for change. Shaw is lonely in these years. He has acquaintances, but few close friends. His Irish accent marks him as an outsider, and his strong opinions often make others uneasy. Yet he relishes debate. He joins discussion groups, where he challenges speakers twice his age, never afraid to seem arrogant if it means testing an idea. He learns to enjoy the clash of arguments, the sparks that fly when two minds meet in opposition. Historians debate how much pain these years truly caused him. Some say he suffered deeply, feeling ignored and misunderstood. Others argue that he secretly enjoyed the role of the overlooked genius, that the hardship gave him a story to tell later. Whatever the truth, you can see how each rejection, each thin meal, each long walk in the rain, carved him into the man he would become. There is one small amusing story from this time. When he sent his first novel to a publisher, he later confessed that he felt so certain of rejection that he did not even bother to check the post for weeks. When the refusal finally came, he shrugged, laughed, and wrote another. This mixture of pride and resilience would stay with him for life. As you linger in this chapter, you notice how his failure to find success in fiction pushes him closer to criticism and then, slowly, toward theater. His notebooks are filling with ideas not just for stories but for arguments. Characters who speak boldly, scenes that unfold like debates. The spark of the dramatist is already there, hidden within the struggling novelist. You leave him now at his desk, pen in hand, eyes bright despite the thin light and thin meals. He does not know yet that his novels will be forgotten, but he believes utterly in the worth of his labor. You sense that these are the final rehearsals before a great shift. The stage is waiting for him, though he cannot yet see its lights. For now, you sit beside him in silence, the sound of the pen scratching on paper. Another page filled, another dream taking form. You step into the crowded playhouses of London, where the smell of gaslight, dust, and sweat mingles with the murmurs of an eager audience. The 1880s are giving way to the 1890s. And George Bernard Shaw is beginning to discover that the theater, not the novel, will be his true battlefield. You see him slipping into the cheapest seats, notebook in hand, studying every actor's gesture and every audience reaction. He is no longer just a struggling writer, he is becoming a critic, and soon, a playwright. At first, he sharpens his tongue as a theater reviewer. He writes for the Saturday Review, using the stage as his subject and wit as his weapon. He praises talent where he finds it, but he is merciless with mediocrity. One well-known fact is that his reviews made him feared and admired in equal measure. Actors trembled at the thought of his words appearing in print, but he also became a champion of new drama, especially the work of Henrik Ibsen, whose realistic plays challenged the safe conventions of London theatre. Shaw's famous essay, The Quintessence of Ibsenism, argued that plays should deal with real social issues, not just polite entertainment. The theatre quickly becomes his mission field. He is not interested in pleasing crowds with light comedies. Instead, he wants to force audiences to think. You sit with him at his desk as he drafts his first serious plays, later grouped together as plays unpleasant. Titles like Widowers' Houses and Mrs. Warren's Profession dig into uncomfortable truths about poverty, prostitution, and hypocrisy. They are not warmly received at first. Critics call them lectures disguised as drama, but Shaw is delighted to provoke. Historians still argue whether these early works were too blunt or whether their boldness was exactly what English theatre needed. You can sense his mischievous delight in upsetting expectations. A quirky detail surfaces from these years when confronted by complaints that his plays were immoral. Shaw replied that the immorality lay not in his words but in the society that made such conditions real. He enjoyed turning accusations back on his critics, often with a grin that made them angrier still. By the mid-1890s he finds a stronger balance between ideas and entertainment. You watch him craft plays pleasant, including Arms and the Man and Candida. These works slip his sharp social arguments inside witty banter and lively characters. Audiences laugh, but they also leave thinking, and that is exactly his goal. You can almost hear the chuckles ripple through the theater, followed by a hush when a line cuts too close to the truth. His approach is unusual. While many playwrights of his time chase romance or melodrama, Shaw insists that plays should mirror real life. with all its awkwardness, contradictions, and debates. He once wrote that he wanted his plays to be like a forum, where opposing views meet and clash. This makes each work feel less like a story and more like a conversation. You, sitting in the audience, are not just entertained, you are challenged. A well-known fact from this stage of his life is that Shah often directed or closely supervised performances of his plays, refusing to let directors soften his points. He believed that every pause, every gesture, carried meaning. This obsession sometimes frustrated actors, but it also ensured that his words struck as sharply as he intended. London society begins to take notice. He is no longer just the odd Irishman muttering in libraries. He is a voice that cannot be ignored. Controversy follows him, but so does growing admiration. Some call him arrogant, others a genius. Either way, people talk about him, and that is exactly what he wants. Historians debate whether Shaw saw theatre primarily as art or as propaganda. He himself blurred the line, insisting that entertainment and social reform could work together. He once joked that if he wanted to send a message, he would call Western Union, but then he immediately delivered plays filled with sharp social commentary. His contradictions make him fascinating. You imagine him leaving the theatre late at night, coat flapping in the London fog, smiling to himself at the uproar his words have caused. He loves nothing more than stirring conversation, and if his plays scandalize, so much the better. His mission is becoming clear, to use the stage as a mirror, forcing society to confront itself. As you drift out of this chapter, you see Shah moving with new confidence, no longer the hungry youth scribbling novels in isolation, but a public figure shaping debates from the stage. The theatre has given him his arena, and he will not leave it. The lights dim, the curtain falls, but his words linger in the air, sharper than swords, impossible to ignore. You step into a modest meeting hall thick with the smell of smoke and damp coats, the sound of earnest voices rising and falling in debate. It is the late 1880s, and Shaw has found a new stage, not with velvet curtains, but with wooden benches and chalkboards. This is the Fabian Society, a small but fiery group of thinkers devoted to gradual social reform. You take a seat in the back as Shaw leans forward, his eyes bright, his long fingers tapping impatiently, eager to speak. The Fabian Society is not a revolutionary club in the style of Marxists or anarchists. Instead, it favors slow, steady reform, working within existing structures to spread socialist ideas. A well-known fact is that the society published pamphlets and organized lectures that would influence British politics for decades, eventually feeding into the birth of the Labour Party. Shaw, with his wit and energy, quickly becomes one of its most visible voices. You hear him debate with conviction. He argues that inequality is not just unfortunate but unnecessary, that society can and must be improved through better laws, education, and economics. Yet he does not rant, he dazzles. His sentences roll like waves, sharp and playful, making opponents laugh even as they realize he has boxed them in. He believes ideas must be both true and entertaining if they are to spread. A quirky detail appears in his pamphlet writing. Shaw often strapped for money, sometimes printed Fabian tracts on cheap paper that smeared ink onto readers' fingers. He joked that socialism should leave a mark. Even literally, he delighted in crafting titles that caught the eye, using humor as bait for serious argument. In smoky rooms across London, you watch him stand before workers, students, and curious middle-class listeners. He speaks without notes, letting his quick mind do the work. He thrives on interruptions, enjoying hecklers because they give him someone to defeat in real time. Historians still argue whether his role in the Fabian Society was more about style than substance, whether he was the soul of the movement or simply its loudest trumpet. What is clear is that his voice carried, and people listened. He even tries his hand at electoral politics. You follow him as he runs for office several times under the banner of socialism, though never successfully. He knocks on doors, distributes leaflets, and speaks at outdoor gatherings. Crowds gather partly for the novelty of hearing a playwright argue about land taxes. Though he loses every race, he gains practice in public performance, sharpening the skills that will serve him both in theatre and in public life. A well-known fact from this period is his role in drafting the Fabian Tracts, pamphlets that explain socialist principles in plain language. He helped write and edit many of them, turning abstract economics into vivid examples. He compared poverty to preventable illness, greed to a contagious disease, wealth inequality to a broken machine that needed repair. His metaphors made difficult ideas accessible, winning sympathy even from those who had never thought about politics. You catch glimpses of his restless schedule. By day he writes essays, reviews, and plays. By evening he attends meetings, debates, and lectures. He is everywhere, his tall frame unmistakable, his voice ringing out, his arguments cutting deep. He thrives on the mix of art and politics, believing they are two parts of the same mission. For him, drama can spread ideas, and ideas can shape drama. Historians debate whether Shaw's socialism softened or hardened over time. Some say he grew more practical, preferring reform to revolution. Others insist he always kept a radical streak, hidden under layers of wit. His critics accused him of being inconsistent, But Shaw himself laughed at such charges, saying consistency was a petty virtue. What mattered to him was effect. Did words move people? Did they stir thought? Did they change anything at all? One quirky anecdote comes from a Fabian meeting where Shaw, faced with a particularly dull lecture, stood up and interrupted the speaker by declaring that the only way to wake up the room was to say something shocking. He then launched into a playful argument that almost everything society believed about morality was backward. The room erupted, the debate roared to life, and Shaw beamed as though he had lit a fire. You step outside with him after one of these meetings. The London fog settling over the lampposts. He pulls his coat close, his breath visible in the cold air, and you hear him chuckle to himself, replaying a clever line he had delivered. For him, debate is not just duty, it is delight. The Fabian Society has given him a new community, a place where his passion for ideas meets others equally hungry for change. As you drift from this chapter, you see Shaw carrying two torches now, one for the theatre and one for politics. In smoky rooms and bright stages alike, he is determined to provoke, to awaken, to unsettle. The young man who once muttered to himself in Dublin and starved in London has become a voice others cannot ignore. The air feels charged, as though he is preparing not just plays but sparks that might ignite an entire generation. You find yourself in the bustling heart of London at the turn of the century, where theatre posters flap in the wind and Shaw's name begins to glow with notoriety. His plays are no longer just experiments or curiosities, they are sparking arguments in newspapers, over dinner tables, and in crowded auditoriums. You walk with him through the Strand, hearing snatches of conversations where his titles are mentioned, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with outrage. Fame has found him, though never quietly. One well-known fact is that Arms and the Man, first performed in 1894, delighted audiences with its playful skewering of romanticized views of war. The audience laughed so loudly that Shaw was both pleased and annoyed. They thought it a comedy, while he wanted them to also grasp its critique. This blend of entertainment and provocation became his signature. Soon, Candida and the Devil's Disciple brought more recognition, and by the early 1900s, his reputation as a dramatist was firmly established. Controversy was never far away. When Mrs. Warren's Profession, a play about prostitution and hypocrisy, was staged in 1902, it caused a public scandal. Authorities threatened to ban it, critics called it indecent, and polite society gasped. But Shaw stood his ground. He insisted the real obscenity was not the play, but the conditions it depicted. Historians still argue whether Shaw enjoyed the outrage as much as the acclaim, or whether he truly cared only about the ideas. What you sense is that he loved both, the laughter of an audience and the fury of the critics, all proof that his words mattered. A quirky detail adds color here. Shaw sometimes slipped into his own performances in disguise, sitting in the audience to observe reactions firsthand. He loved to watch faces at the moment of a shocking line, noting who laughed nervously, who frowned, who leaned forward. For him the audience was part of the play, and he considered their reactions his truest review. His fame begins to stretch beyond London. Productions of his plays appear in America, Europe, and even further afield. Translators wrestle with his sharp wit, trying to keep its sparkle alive in other tongues. You imagine him reading foreign reviews with a smirk, pleased that even across oceans, his words could stir quarrels. By this point his critics call him both brilliant and unbearable. Some accuse him of arrogance, and perhaps they are right. Shaw himself joked that modesty was a quality he never had to worry about. Yet even in his wit, you see discipline. He spends long hours revising scripts, shaping dialogue until it cuts with precision. He insists that every word on stage must serve purpose, whether to make the audience laugh, think, or squirm. He also begins to enjoy the life of a public figure. Invitations arrive from literary clubs, universities, and even aristocratic salons. You see him stride into rooms where velvet curtains and chandeliers hang, his presence commanding attention. Tall, lean, with his trademark beard, he speaks with the confidence of someone who knows both his genius and his power to irritate. He wears his Irish outsider status as a badge, often poking fun at the English elite even as they invite him to dinner. A well-known fact is that Shaw turned down financial opportunities that might have made him wealthy. He believed theatre should challenge rather than flatter, so he often chose plays that risked failure over safer projects. He lived simply, partly by choice, partly from habit after years of poverty. Money interested him far less than influence. Historians debate whether Shaw saw himself primarily as a dramatist or as a social critic who used drama as a tool. His plays often feel like debates set to dialogue, their characters less like individuals and more like ideas in motion. Yet his gift for humor and irony gave them life, saving them from dryness. Some audiences adored this blend, others dismissed it as lecturing. Either way, they remembered it. A quirky anecdote from these years tells of a wealthy patron who praised Shaw's wit and asked how he came by such clever lines. Shaw supposedly replied, "The world provides them, I only write them down." That sly remark reveals his habit of watching closely, stealing from reality, and polishing it into art. You walk with him through the theatre district at night, gas lamps glowing, the chatter of crowds filling the air. Somewhere, a playbill with his name flutters on a wall, and you feel the weight of his growing fame. He is no longer the obscure Irish boy scribbling in notebooks. He is a celebrated and controversial playwright whose words ripple far beyond the stage. As this chapter closes, you picture Shaw at his writing desk once more, pen in hand, his face half in shadow, half in lamplight. He smiles faintly, knowing that with every new play he is not just entertaining but stirring the conscience of his time. Fame has arrived, but for Shaw, fame is only useful if it unsettles. You linger now in the quietest spaces of Shaw's life, where the noise of theatre and public debate softens into the rhythms of companionship, affection, and the stubborn streak of independence that defined him. Behind the fiery playwright and the sharp critic, there was also a man navigating love, marriage, and the peculiar balance between intimacy and distance. It is here that Charlotte Payne Townshend enters the story. An Irish heiress with independent means and a restless spirit. Charlotte met Shaw through Fabian friends in the 1890s. She was clever, witty, and not easily impressed. Qualities that immediately caught his attention. At first he resisted any hint of romance. Marriage, Shaw often declared, was a trap, a social contract that suffocated freedom. Yet Charlotte's persistence, humor, and generosity wore down his defenses. The well-known fact is that they married in 1898, though even their wedding seemed unconventional. There were no grand celebrations or dramatic vows. Instead, it was quiet, almost matter-of-fact, as if both were aware they were entering into an arrangement shaped less by passion than by shared respect and companionship. Shaw was in his early 40s, Charlotte in her late 30s, mature, thoughtful, and independent. But this was no ordinary marriage. Historians and biographers often point out that Shaw and Charlotte lived much of their married life more like intellectual partners than traditional spouses. Their union was childless, and Shaw's sexuality, or perhaps lack of interest in physical intimacy, remains a subject of speculation. Some suggest he avoided sex altogether, considering it messy and distracting. Others argue that his attachment to Charlotte was deep, if unconventional. The truth, as always, lies in the quiet spaces of letters and glances history cannot fully capture. What you sense is a partnership rooted in mutual support. Charlotte managed Shaw's often chaotic personal affairs, organizing finances, correspondence, and practical matters he disdained. In return, Shaw offered her companionship, admiration, and the steady presence of his brilliant, if exasperating, mind. Together they created a household where ideas flowed freely, even if the traditional warmth of domestic life was less obvious. A quirky detail brightens this picture. Charlotte once bought Shaw a typewriter, believing it would speed up his work, but he disliked it, preferring the scratch of pen on paper. "The machine writes faster than I think," he complained, and promptly abandoned it. Charlotte, amused, never pressed the matter again. It was one of many examples of her tolerance for his eccentricities. Their relationship was not without storms. Shaw's fame brought endless admirers, young women, actresses, fellow intellectuals, who were drawn to his wit and charisma. Flirtations peppered his correspondence, and rumors of emotional entanglements swirled. Yet Charlotte held her ground. She did not fit the image of a neglected wife, nor of a jealous one. Instead, she seemed to accept Shaw as he was, brilliant, difficult, and incapable of being molded. Historians debate whether Charlotte's wealth and stability allowed Shaw the freedom to pursue his career without financial strain. It is certain that her support made his life easier. He never chased money, and thanks to her, he did not need to. What emerged was a curious balance. Shaw, the iconoclast railing against society's norms, living securely in a marriage that defied convention yet endured for more than 4 decades. There were tender moments, though few were publicly displayed. In letters, Shaw sometimes dropped his public armor, addressing Charlotte with warmth and teasing affection. You can almost hear his voice soften in those lines, the sharpness replaced by a gentler cadence. Behind the firebrand was a man capable of private tenderness, if not in ways most people expect. One anecdote tells of Shaw falling ill and Charlotte nursing him with quiet devotion. For a man who prized independence, accepting care was difficult, yet he allowed her to look after him. It was in such moments perhaps that the essence of their bond revealed itself, not in romance as most imagine, but in the steady loyalty of two people who chose to remain together despite their differences. As you walk with him through their home in AOT St. Lawrence, Hertfordshire, you notice a garden, a library, and the hum of domestic peace. Shaw writes in his study, Charlotte manages affairs in another room, and between them flows an invisible thread of understanding. They live side by side, separate yet connected, each free in their own way, yet bound by decades of shared life. Their story challenges easy definitions. Was it love? Friendship? Partnership? Perhaps all at once, perhaps none in the ordinary sense. But what matters is that it endured, shaped by stubbornness, wit, and the quiet resilience of two people who refused to be ordinary. And so, you see Shaw not only as a playwright and reformer but also as a husband, an unconventional one, yes, but a husband nonetheless. His marriage, like his plays, was both a provocation and a reflection of his belief that life should be lived on one's own terms, not dictated by society. You move with Shaw now into the bright glare of recognition, where his words no longer echo in small halls or hushed libraries but are celebrated on grand stages across the world. The man who once struggled to sell his novels now found himself at the center of cultural life, praised, attacked, and always listened to. The well-known fact here is that in 1925, George Bernard Shaw received the Nobel Prize in Literature. The honor came after decades of writing plays that had unsettled and entertained audiences. From Man and Superman to St. Joan, the committee praised him for his work infused with idealism and humanity, for his sharp satire, and for his ability to combine seriousness with laughter. Yet, true to his character, Shaw treated the prize with irony. He quipped that the Nobel was a lifebelt thrown to a swimmer already ashore. He accepted the honor but declined the money, suggesting it be used to fund translations of Swedish literature into English. Shaw never shied away from turning solemn ceremony into theater. At public events, he sprinkled sharp humor into speeches, mocking pomp while still participating in it. A quirky detail stands out when invited to Hollywood to adapt Pygmalion into film. Shaw insisted on writing dialogue himself, even adding strict instructions to preserve his words exactly. His version went on to win an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay in 1938, making him one of the few people in history to hold both a Nobel Prize and an Oscar. Historians still argue whether Shaw's fame changed him, or if he merely grew more stubborn in the light of it. Some suggest he became more cautious, aware that every word he uttered could provoke headlines. Others argue the opposite, that fame freed him further, giving him license to say exactly what he thought. What cannot be denied is that he relished the attention while pretending to dismiss it. You stand beside him at events where he dazzled audiences with spontaneous wit. Asked once whether he was proud of the Nobel, he replied that it was an insult to honor him in his old age after ignoring him in his youth. Such remarks made headlines, ensuring that the very prize he mocked only added to his legend. His plays, too, began to take on a new sheen in this period of recognition. Pygmalion, in particular, enchanted audiences with its clever examination of class and language. While viewers laughed at the transformation of Eliza Doolittle under Professor Higgins, Shaw intended it as a critique of social pretensions. The play's later adaptation into My Fair Lady softened its sharp edges, turning it into a romantic tale, much to Shaw's irritation. He had always insisted it was not a love story but a satire of English society. Even here, you sense his independence. He refused to allow even his most beloved works to be misunderstood without a fight. In his rise to international fame, Shaw continued to clash with critics, officials, and even governments. He traveled widely, giving lectures and interviews that left audiences alternately charmed and infuriated. Reporters flocked to him because he was guaranteed to say something outrageous. He once declared that an Englishman's way of dealing with ideas was to ignore them, a line that drew laughter from some and fury from others. Charlotte, steady as ever, often accompanied him, ensuring that his schedule and health were managed. She quietly endured the endless chatter about his plays, his politics, and his pronouncements. Together they embodied a curious domestic life, where he thrived in the spotlight, and she ensured the machinery behind the scenes kept running smoothly. You imagine him sitting in his study after a day of interviews, reflecting not with satisfaction but with a mischievous sense of triumph. Fame was never his goal. He claimed he only wanted to change how people thought. Yet recognition gave him a stage larger than any theater, whether he was mocking kings, praising women's independence, or warning against blind nationalism. Shaw now had the world's attention. Historians point out that even with such fame, Shaw remained financially modest. His works provided steady income, but he lived without extravagance. His house at Iot St. Lawrence, called Shaw's Corner, was comfortable but not luxurious. In the garden, he had a small revolving hut, nicknamed the Shelter, that turned with the sun, where he wrote many of his later plays. There he could bask in light, sheltered by glass and wood, composing words that would soon travel far beyond his quiet village. Recognition did not soften his edges, but it added new layers to his persona. To some, he was a prophet, to others, a clown, to still others, a dangerous thinker. The truth lay somewhere in between, in the playful seriousness that made him both admired and misunderstood. And so, as you walk with him through this golden chapter, you feel the weight of his fame, bright, dazzling, sometimes heavy, but always carried with a wink and a well-placed quip. You sit closer now, where the warmth of recognition fades into the chill of conflict. And Shaw's words, once playful provocations, sharpen into blades during the storms of politics and war. The same tongue that made audiences laugh could also ignite fierce anger. And during the turbulent years of the early 20th century, he used it freely. The well-known fact is that during the First World War, Shaw published a pamphlet titled Common Sense About the War, in which he criticized both Britain and Germany, accusing leaders on both sides of being reckless. The public reaction was swift and bitter. Many saw him as unpatriotic, even traitorous, for questioning his own country during wartime. The press vilified him. Friends turned cold, and theaters hesitated to stage his plays. Yet Shaw did not back down. He insisted that blind loyalty was more dangerous than honest criticism. A quirky detail from this stormy period comes from Shaw's habit of writing long letters to newspapers, often several columns long, filled with witty barbs and searing arguments. Editors both dreaded and delighted in them, dreaded because they stirred outrage, delighted because they sold papers. Even when readers cursed his name, they could not resist reading what he had to say. Historians still argue whether Shaw's interventions in political debates helped or harmed his reputation. Some believe he bravely exposed hypocrisies at a time when silence was easier. Others believe his contrarian streak led him to reckless positions, alienating audiences who might otherwise have been allies. The truth is that Shaw relished the role of provocateur, never content to let consensus go unchallenged. His sharp words did not fade with the armistice. In the 1920s and 30s, he spoke admiringly of leaders such as Lenin and, controversially, even Mussolini, praising their energy in reshaping society. Later he visited the Soviet Union where he met Stalin. While many intellectuals were alarmed by Stalin's brutality, Shaw emerged defending him, declaring that he had seen no evidence of oppression. To this day, scholars wrestle with this contradiction, how a man so committed to social justice could turn a blind eye to tyranny. You watch him in these years, standing before audiences with piercing eyes and a voice that carried both warmth and scorn. He was no longer the playful Irish critic of the 1890s, but a global figure, his opinions dissected in every major paper. Even when people hated what he said, they listened. Perhaps that was his greatest gift, to remain unavoidable. At the same time, Shaw's plays continued to appear on stage, their humor and depth softening the edges of his political controversies. Works like St. Joan captured both admiration and debate, with critics praising its vision of conscience against authority. The play was written in 1923, shortly after Joan of Arc was canonized by the Catholic Church, and Shaw's version presented her as a stubborn visionary, unafraid to defy kings and bishops alike. Audiences recognized in her something of Shaw himself, fearless, uncompromising, and sometimes maddening. Despite storms of politics, he never abandoned his wit. During a lecture in America, when challenged by a heckler, he calmly replied, "I can forgive you for not agreeing with me, but I cannot forgive you for not letting me finish." Laughter filled the hall, proof that even in tense debates, his humor disarmed critics. Charlotte, by his side, often sighed at the endless controversies. She preferred the quiet rhythms of their home, yet she stood by him as letters and headlines swirled around. She once joked that if Shaw ever stopped arguing, the world might stop spinning. It was perhaps her way of resigning herself to his nature. He could no more silence himself than he could stop breathing. Historians note that his political positions did not fit neatly into any category. He was socialist but not Marxist, radical yet skeptical of revolution, pacifist but fascinated by strong leaders. This inconsistency frustrated both supporters and opponents, yet it kept him impossible to pin down. Shaw seemed to delight in this slipperiness, warning his audiences never to accept him as an oracle. And yet, you sense the toll it took. In moments of quiet, away from reporters and speeches, Shaw admitted wariness with the misunderstandings his words provoked. Still, he refused to soften. His mission, as he saw it, was not to soothe but to awaken. As you stand beside him in these years, you hear his voice cut through smoke-filled halls, across newsprint pages, and into the private chatter of households. Some curse him, others cheer him, but none ignore him. In politics, as in theater, George Bernard Shaw remained the master of provocation, determined to keep the world talking. You follow Shaw now into the quiet years of his later life, where the pace slows but the mind remains sharp, restless, and endlessly curious. The theaters still stage his plays, the press still quotes him, but he moves with the deliberate rhythm of someone who has survived storms and survived himself. You watch him in his study at Shaw's Corner, the sunlight falling across his papers, the garden humming with late summer warmth. Even in old age, he continues to write. One well-known fact is that Shaw completed plays well into his 80s, including Buoyant Billions and The Simpleton of the Unexpected Isles. Each new work carries the same blend of wit, social critique, and philosophical debate, though tempered by the experience of a lifetime. You sense that his energy has shifted from raw provocation to a refined insistence. Ideas must be clear, humor must enlighten, and every character must have a purpose. His days are punctuated by walks through the gardens of Iot St. Lawrence. He inspects plants, observes birds, and sometimes mutters lines of dialogue under his breath. A quirky detail is his fascination with the small things. A snail crawling across a leaf might inspire a metaphor. A cloud's shape might spark a new argument in a play. To Shaw, life is always material for thought, and nothing is too trivial to observe. Historians still argue whether Shaw mellowed or merely became more strategic in his provocations. Certainly, his later works are less likely to shock for the sake of shock, but they retain the intellectual edge that defined him. He continues to challenge audiences, but the sharpness is now seasoned with patience, as if decades of debate and experience have taught him the value of subtlety. Charlotte, still by his side, ensures that domestic life remains a quiet sanctuary. Together, they host writers, politicians, and thinkers, exchanging ideas over tea, while Shaw engages guests with relentless curiosity. Charlotte orchestrates the rhythm of the household, a steady presence allowing him to continue his extraordinary work. You notice how Shaw reflects on the span of his life. He occasionally revisits early manuscripts, reading them with a mixture of amusement and pride. Rejection, poverty, and struggle have faded into memory, leaving him grateful for both the hardships and the triumphs. A well-known fact is that he often credited his early years of struggle with shaping the discipline and vision that sustained his career. He was never sentimental about poverty but understood it as a forge for character. Even in quiet, he remains opinionated. He writes letters to editors, responds to critics, and comments on political developments worldwide. A quirky habit persists. He continues to speak with the same theatricality he displayed on stage, gesturing dramatically even when alone, imagining audiences who no longer exist. Shaw's mind remains hungry for ideas. He reads constantly, from philosophy to science, from biographies to economics. He questions everything, even his own convictions, believing that growth requires continual reassessment. Historians still argue whether his lifelong pursuit of knowledge was driven by curiosity, vanity, or the simple delight of being right. You sense it is all three, blended with a gentle playfulness that tempers the rigor. In these final years, he also contemplates legacy. He establishes trusts and guidelines for his works, ensuring that his plays will continue to provoke thought long after he is gone. You walk beside him in his garden one last time, sunlight warm on the back of your neck, hearing him comment on how ideas, once spoken, belong not to the speaker but to the world. His voice is soft now, still commanding, still alive with mischief and insight. And as you leave him in these autumnal years, you realize that George Bernard Shaw's life was a continuous conversation with the world. From Dublin streets to London stages, from political debates to domestic gardens, he engaged every corner of existence with curiosity, wit, and courage. You step away carrying with you the echo of his laughter, the scratch of his pen, and the enduring lesson that a life lived fully is one that never stops questioning, never stops imagining, and never stops insisting that words matter.